Hey, what's up? Justin here. Welcome to 65 Drums, the place to keep on top of everything electronic drum related. Now, for one reason or another, you probably have bought one of these guys. This is a clip-on trigger for the rim of your drum. Sometimes we'll buy these for, turning acoustic snares into electronic snares. That's what I did with this DDrum red shot trigger right here. Really cheap and easy to do that. Sometimes you'll spend a little bit more money and buy like a Roland RT series. This is a Roland RT10. There are the Roland RT 30s. Yamaha just came out with some really sweet looking chrome triggers. There's a billion different drum triggers out there is what I'm trying to say here. And you buy them either to turn your acoustic drums into electronic, or maybe your electronic pad just stopped working one day, and instead of mailing it back to Alesis to try to get fixed, or mailing it back to Roland to try to get it fixed, you just decided to buy one of these guys. The reason why electronic drums just work so well out of the box is because everything's designed from the ground up to be compatible with each other. The cymbals, the snare, the toms, the kick drum, the drum module, all that is designed from the ground up to be compatible with each other. And when you start mixing different kinds of brands of triggers with different kinds of brands of drum modules, maybe a different kind of brand of mesh drum, and then you got that on some sort of drum shell, a lot of different variations are there that you're not usually encountering if you're just playing a stock Roland TD11K, maybe a stock Alesis Crimson. Usually that stuff just works out of the box. What I'm trying to do with this video is show you a bunch of really simple solutions to simple problems that you'll come across when you're using a rim-mounted drum trigger. Because, it's not always going to be 100% smooth sailing. Whenever you start using drum triggers like this, or ones that you put inside of your drum shell, like a drum tech trigger or a Joe Becky trigger, you're going to have to do some setting stuff in the module to make sure everything's working 100% perfect. All right, so let's jump into it. Problem number one, and nearly everybody has had this problem before at least one time or another. You hit the drum once, and for some reason, your drum module thinks that you hit it 5 darn times. This problem is called false triggering. You actually have a bunch of things you can do to fix this inside of the drum module. It's really not a tough problem at all if you're using a mesh drum head. Whenever you're using acoustic heads, it's actually twice as hard to get good triggering results as opposed to using mesh heads, because mesh heads are just a lot easier. All right, so here's what you can do to fix this problem. Number one, increase the mask time number. What you're doing when you're setting a mask time is you're telling your drum module, you're basically setting a policy that says, whenever you detect one hit, you need to ignore all other hits for this many milliseconds. You decide how many milliseconds the drum module gets to ignore all incoming signals. The reason why drum triggers accidentally, start doing false triggering is because your mesh head is actually bouncing around a lot. And sometimes it's hard for your drum module to differentiate between what's a hit and what's an aftershock wave of your first hit. So setting a mask time is telling your drum module, after you hear the first hit, ignore all other hits for this many milliseconds, and that should cut out a lot of the false triggering. Retrigger cancel also does something similar. So if mask time is not inside of your drum module, or if you don't want to push mask time any farther, increase the retrigger cancel just a little bit in order to fix it. Remember, you want to increase all these different settings just a little bit at a time, because if you go too far, mask time will just mask all of your playing. Because if you increase the milliseconds way too far, it'll actually start losing out on hits that you're trying to play yourself. Another setting you can mess around with is called threshold. Threshold is basically you telling your drum module, hey, don't accept trigger impulses from the drum trigger. Don't acknowledge that they exist until they get this loud or louder than that. So you're setting a limit, a threshold for what it will detect as a drum hit. So the reason why you might want to raise that just a little bit is to ignore some of the, aftershock waves of you actually hitting the drum. So if you raise it just a little bit, it might fix the problem if mask time just isn't doing the job. Now, you got to be really, really careful with threshold, because if you raise it too high, you'll start canceling out all the ghost notes. Because if you set up the threshold this high, then it won't even recognize your hard hits. So be really careful with all these adjustments that you're making. And if everything just gets messed up, you can always, factory reset the drum module and put everything back to the way it was in the beginning. You can start from scratch. But ideally, you don't want to go there. So just make really small incremental adjustments until you get the right result. And of course, this brings us to problem number two. My drum trigger isn't picking up all the ghost notes. The good news is this problem is way easier to fix than the first one. The first one you had to mess with like 2 or 3 different settings possibly to get the result that you wanted. With this one, where it's just not picking up the really soft hits, it's pretty darn simple. Only 2 things are probably happening right now. Number 1, maybe your drum trigger isn't making full enough contact with the mesh head. This actually happens more times than you think it would. So for example, if you have something like a DDrum red shot, maybe just tighten it down a little bit more. Don't go crazy, but if it's not making firm enough contact with the mesh head, so it's not picking up the really soft stuff, tighten it down a little bit more. Some of the older drum triggers like this Roland RT10, you actually have to level it. You have to set how hard the cone is pressing up against that mesh head. If you have something like an internal trigger, like a Jobecki side-mounted internal trigger, you have to decide how hard that foam is, pushing up against the mesh head. So if it's like barely touching it, it's not going to pick up the really soft hits. This happened to me on my kick drum trigger because it was slowly starting to move away from the mesh head. So it would only pick up sounds when the mesh head got hit so hard it was actually bending in towards the trigger. So number 1, take a look at your trigger. Number 2, your threshold setting might be too high. In order for you to fix the previous problem, maybe you went overboard on your settings and the threshold's way too high. So lower the threshold a little bit until you start picking up those ghost notes. Okay, so let's move on to problem number 3. Maybe your drum module is picking up every little ghost note and everything, but you have to hit pretty darn hard in order to hear a loud sound coming from the drum module. How do you make it so the softer hits are picked up as a louder signal? They're still being picked up, but you just want the drum module to act as if you're hitting a little bit harder than you are right now. Very simple fix. All you got to do is go into the settings and turn up the sensitivity. You can turn up the sensitivity so high that just tapping on it will produce a maximum hit. Now, of course, you're probably going for a little more finesse than that, but here's a really good rule of thumb whenever you're trying to set up the sensitivity settings for all of your drum pads. Make it so that you have to hit as hard as you can in order to peak out at 100% volume. That way, everything is set up for your playing style. And if you want to dial all this in even more, you can go to the trigger curve section of your drum module. I know this is getting kind of technical and everything, but there's a section in a lot of different modules called trigger curve. This is how it reacts to your playing. There's a lot of different types like log 1, log 2, S-curve, exponential, and linear. Here's how it all breaks down. If you want a really acoustic-like response, just set it to linear. If you want it to be ultra responsive and just really sensitive to your playing, set it to log 1 or log 2. On the other hand, if you want it to be a little less responsive, you want to back it down a little bit because you're a hard hitter, then set the trigger type to exponential 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so let's go on to problem number 4. Now this is usually just an annoying thing, not like a make or break problem, but here's the simple fix. If you're playing on the drum and you realize, man, no matter how soft I played, it's always picking it up as a really loud hit. That means your drum trigger is way too close to wherever you're playing with your sticks. So just shift that drum trigger farther away from wherever you play on the drum, and you should be good to go. If it's like still way too hot, that means you probably have the drum trigger, way too hard pressed against the mesh head, so you might need to loosen it up a little bit. Another common problem is when your drum rim is way too quiet, and you need to bring that volume up. And just hitting it harder isn't the answer. What you can do is go over to trigger settings and go to rim gain, and then slowly bring that up until it's at the volume that you want it to be. Something really important to remember is that you got to select the correct pad type inside of your trigger settings. In that top menu, you'll notice that you can select it as like a Roland RT30, a Roland RT10, a Roland PD128, whatever kind of pad type you want. And if you've got like one brand of drum trigger and you're using the exact same brand with the drum module, Roland, Alesis, whoever that company is, they probably have a trigger type set up so it works 99% right out of the box. So when I'm using a Roland RT10 drum trigger, I want to use Roland RT10 trigger settings, and you can select that in the menu. I had to update my module to make it work with the Roland RT30 trigger because they released the trigger after the module was released, so I had to download that from the website, and now they have a complete trigger preset for that drum trigger as well. Now, if you're mixing and matching two different brands, then you're just going to have to try a bunch of different trigger presets because there isn't one exactly made for your drum trigger. But just, try out a bunch of different trigger types and see what you can come up with. The thing about drum triggers is that sometimes it just takes experimentation. You might have to spend a solid 15 minutes on this and find the really simple combination of different threshold and mass time settings in order to fix the problem. Or maybe you just installed it incorrectly and it's, not putting enough contact against the mesh head, or maybe too much contact. You're just gonna have to experiment a little bit, be patient. There have been plenty of times where I've just gotten really, really mad at my drum triggers. I'm like,
why aren't you working?
And it's not really the drum trigger's fault most of the time. It's just the fact that I'm not using the right settings, or I'm not putting the drum trigger in the right place. So just be patient, mess around with the settings, ask for help sometimes, and you'll figure it out. Drum triggers, usually you can fix any problem that comes at you. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in a few.